Welcome to Fortress on a Hill. I'm Henry.
I'm Danny.
I'm Kagan.
We're three leftist veterans that aim to expose the reality of the U.S. military's multiple wars abroad and to illuminate the damage military service does to Americans.
American presidents throughout U.S. history have used American military and diplomatic power to force regime change of democratically elected governments around the world.
Most veterans come from families vested in prior service, and American generals choose their own, ensuring diversity of thought never interferes with American warmongering.
How can we stand by and do nothing while our military kills and destroys lives the world over, while telling Americans that all this death and destruction protects them from terrorists when nothing could be more false?
Fortress on a Hill aims to change that.
Welcome back, listeners, to Fortress on a Hill. We are keeping going. Biden has been elected, it seems, right? Well, he's been elected. Looks like he'll be president, theoretically. And wouldn't you know that the problems have not yet been solved, but give it a month, I'm sure they will. But obviously, we've got 1,000 more things to talk about. And as even the folks who we talked so much about on that, Joe Biden foreign policy record episode right before the election that, everyone loved and we didn't get any pushback on, none at all, I promise. We talked so much during that episode about, hey, regardless of where you fall on that, I think it was pretty clear where we did ultimately fall. People like, Noam Chomsky and Cornel West and these key, stalwarts of like the progressive movement and sort of anti-militarism, where they fell, which is, hey, like, let's get this guy in office who we can maybe work a little bit more around the margins with, and then don't take your foot off the gas pedal. And no one's ever accused us here of doing that. So we've got a lot more to talk about and a lot more guests. And we've been on an incredible run for really about a year. And it's no different today. Our guest today is Dr. Ben Freeman, who is a colleague and really, sort of becoming a friend and just collaborator, commiserator over at the Center for International Policy. He is the director of the Foreign Influence Transparency Initiative over there. And there's a lot of stuff cooking at CIP that we'll talk about, a new blog, the Baraza, just so many reports. And the stuff that Ben is working on and the stuff that's being worked on across all the different initiatives and programs over there have been incredibly timely with what's going on. So basic bio stuff. Ben is, like I said, the director of the Foreign Influence Transparency Initiative. What does he do there? Well, in general, he works to expose how foreign governments are influencing U.S. public policy and elections, building upon, his book, The Foreign Policy Auction, which we'll link to, really one of the first books to systematically analyze the foreign influence industry in the U.S. And I don't think that gets enough attention, particularly in the mainstream, and particularly if it affects folks besides Trump, right? So the expansion of that to a broader foreign influence industry is interesting. Before launching that, he was deputy director of the National Security Program at Third Way. Prior to that, Ben was a National Security Fellow at the Project on Government Oversight, POGO, and that was 2011 to 13. And, POGO does amazing work on Revolving Door. They kind of spun out of CDI, Center for Defense Information, something that one of our other guests, Ben Cohen, has been like a big champion of and trying to recreate. And he's, really, really supports the work of POGO. While he was there, he spearheaded the creation of their foreign influence database, and a repository of kind of propaganda distributed by foreign agents. And that had been previously unavailable online or which is where people get their information. So, very basic background. He got his PhD from Texas A&M. His dissertation looked at the ability of foreign governments to effectively lobby for economic and military assistance from the U.S., something that Henry and I have seen kind of in the breach to a certain extent. In fact, Henry, as a military policeman, is kind of the guy for military assistance on some level and security force assistance. And then upon graduation from A&M, he taught in the political science department at the Bush School of Government and Public Policy there at A&M. And he's written in a whole lot of places, in addition to his mega reports that are just wild, and I wish they would print in full, in the New York Times. He writes shorter pieces that have been in the New York Times, Politico, CNN. He's testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee. This is somebody that you need to know. You need to follow on Twitter and just check out. And I know it's going to be a great conversation. So now that I've flattered you more than you're comfortable with, Ben, thanks for coming on.
Danny, thanks so much for having me. I feel like I just want to have you follow me around and give that intro every time I speak somewhere.
I could be like your theme music, except professionally, When I walk around, I feel like, depending on my mood, Roxette's Dangerous plays, or if I'm sad, Roxette's It Must Have Been Love plays. But it would be better, I think, to have, someone giving you like a professional, plaudit as you walk around. So I'm looking for work, and we'll talk about that offline, I think.
Sounds good. But in all seriousness, thank you for the great intro. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for coming. And you've kind of inspired me with your last reports, and we're going to talk about that as we go forward. I've sort of shamelessly plugged and linked to them and used it, particularly the think tank report that came out recently. But what we had like a Zoom call just to talk about some other projects and CIP and moving forward, and then just kind of, social and discussing things. And on that Zoom, we were joking back and forth a whole bunch about the work we do, the beauty of it, the tragedy of it, the difficulties and why we wouldn't have it any other way. And plenty of jokes about how if we wrote reports that were favorable to Raytheon, we'd probably have bigger houses and all this. But I think that even though it's kind of a cliche on podcasts and interviews to, say, oh, tell us your journey, I'm a big believer in human interest, backstory, how people get to where they are. And so, if you could kind of just take us from, womb to the not yet tomb, and kind of, and that is a Nas reference, kiddos. Okay. Pay attention. Just tell us your story, basically, like how you got involved in this work, why you cared, and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. It really begins kind of 20 years ago or so, where I frankly, it begins in a place where somebody who's, now works in DC in this very political world has no business coming from. My mother literally sells seashells by the seashore. I'm not even joking. Her name's not Sally, but otherwise, I'm not joking. I'm from Florida, and my mom owns a shell shop. And that was kind of the family business growing up. So when I went to college to get a business degree. But while I was in college, the tragic events of 9/11 happened, and then the Iraq War happened. I hadn't taken a political science class in my life, but somehow I just sort of knew deep down that the decision to invade Iraq was wrong, and I didn't quite know why. And I come from a more conservative area of Florida. And so I was one of the only people I knew that really disagreed with that decision. All my friends, of course, were saying, "You don't know what you're talking about, shell guy. Go back to the gift shop and shut up about politics." And being the nice Florida man that I am, I basically said, "Hold my beer and watch this." And then I went to grad school for 7 years and ended up getting a master's degree and a PhD in political science. And I very much started my interest in that, was very much sparked by the Iraq War, and a big part of what's ultimately led me to where I am now is understanding the foreign influence component of the Iraq War. And that, of course, is the Saudi lobby, and really kind of the genesis of the modern day lobby starts then. They hired on a firm called Corvus Communications, which continues to be part of the Saudi lobby to this day. Signed a multi-million-dollar contract with them then, and they continue to make millions from the Saudis to this day. And after sort of digging up all that dirt on Corvus and what was going on with the influence operation related to the Iraq War, I never really turned back from investigating foreign influence. As you mentioned, Danny, it's what I wrote my dissertation on at Texas A&M. And the good folks at Pogo were kind enough to hire an ambitious academic nerd to do some more foreign influence work while I was there. Also did some good DoD oversight work there too. But I was able to sort of for the first time share kind of to a wider audience what I had been finding in this really like wild west of foreign influence work. Because this was well before 2016, and I published my book before 2016 too. As I joked with Danny privately, nobody cared, frankly. I'm still not sure if my mom and dad read it. Because foreign influence just wasn't the issue then that it is now. But of course, then 2016 happens, and suddenly my phone's ringing off the hook, and everybody's very interested in this issue once again. And so I viewed it very much as I had an obligation to share the insights that I had found, to share with other folks how to dig up information about what other foreign governments, lobbyists were doing to try and steer U.S. foreign policy in pretty bad directions. And what I really do, I do much less of the Russian interference type work. I call it the regular old mundane $500 million foreign lobbying industry. That's the work that I do, and working to expose that and just explaining to people how influential that industry is in determining foreign policy. And it really doesn't even matter what foreign policy decision you're talking about. Whether it's military assistance to a country, whether it's where we keep our bases, which foreign countries, how many troops there, do we get in the Iran deal, do we get out of the Iran deal? Just about every single foreign policy decision the U.S. makes, there are some serious influences coming from lobbyists working on behalf of foreign governments.
Well, I like how you refer to it as the normal, mundane, millions of dollars and influence of tragic in its consequences U.S. policies. And it's funny how, you talked about the book that you write, your dissertation, your subject, it's not in vogue, right, for the longest time. And then it is, right? It's interesting how subjects, one subject can be out of fashion until it's not. And while the Russian story really piqued everyone's interest, 60% of Americans or so, 51%, I don't know, of the voting Americans, because, Trump's a monster, and he is, and therefore he's, colluding or, quote unquote, with Putin directly and all this. And so suddenly it gets in the news and on the, on the public consciousness, which isn't, in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, because you've been pointing out how broad this is in the first place. And I just wanted to ask you about 2001 and 2003, timing wise. You mentioned how that was so influential to you and how you kind of looked into the foreign aspect of that, which I think has not been looked into enough. A lot of folks would say that, there's really two ways to respond to 9/11 and especially to the Iraq invasion, right? There's only two ways that matter. And it seems like that would be in the common imagination. You either join the military and, ruck up and go fight, or you get in the streets, with Code Pink or whomever, right? Many of which I, collaborate with and enjoy, and fight this thing from the outset. And while I'm sure that I don't know to the extent to which you've done some of the latter, you kind of pick this other path that doesn't get spoken about, which is, look, someone's got to do the real work of finding facts and offering the justification for policy or protest. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little about, career choice in terms of like inflection and the nature of it, and what you think the value of that is.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And thinking back to that time for me, I was in college, and so just sort of going to college and observing that. And I think my gut reaction was, it was the first one you said, was that we got attacked. I should join the military to fight back and defend us. But then what I saw about the decisions that we were making, and that why I was giving that some very serious thought as soon as I left college, that I would do that. But then what I started to see was it wasn't that there were no shortage of the Ben Freemans of the world joining the military. Like, that wasn't the problem. Like, at least the way I saw it, it wasn't a problem of a shortage of people, a shortage of good people joining the military. The problem was a military leadership that would lead us, frankly, astray from Afghanistan and hunting down Osama bin Laden to start a war that we had no business starting. And so then, that's what sort of led me to, look down these other paths. What could possibly lead us to make such a foolish foreign policy choice? I of course ultimately gravitated towards the foreign lobbying element of it that led us to it, and spent a good bit of time documenting that. And I've never really stopped looking at the Saudi lobby. In fact, just this very morning, I was looking up information on the Saudi lobby. So, almost 20 years later, I'm still on the beat. And I think the reason why I do that, and the reason why I think that's very important to do, I love Code Pink and Medea Benjamin and the folks who get in the streets. I think that's incredibly valuable. I just think, for me, my unique contribution is, I'm kind of a nerd. I'm good at I'm good at connecting the dots. I'm good at following the money, and I'm really good at digging up the dirt that I think a lot of these war profiteers don't want dug up. So my value add in terms of stopping us or helping to prevent the next foolish war is doing what I do. It's identifying those foreign influence operations that are trying to lead the U.S. astray, and it's calling out some of the war profiteers who, of course, they're engaging in lobbying and in domestic influence campaigns of their own, whether it's from hiring lobbying firms themselves, or investing in think tanks, or other forms of influence. That there's a huge war profiteering industry that I think we need more people, frankly, to call out everything that they're doing to try and drive the U.S. to more foreign wars.
One last point on that before we kind of move on to some more detail. We had Ali Soufan on the pod maybe 2 or 3 guests ago, that FBI anti-torture, Al-Qaeda guy, Al-Qaeda investigator, Lebanese American. And, so in prepping for that, I think me and Henry both re-looked at the Looming Tower book, the Looming Tower Hulu series, and, other stuff that he's done in either nonfiction or fiction. And one of the things that jumps out in some of his narrative, and definitely in the fictional representations or the, fictional representations of the truth, is right after 9/11, this immediate day of pivot to getting the Saudis out of the country a top priority. And,
right.
And so maybe, touching on that or not, or pivoting from that, why Saudi Arabia? Like, I mean, it sounds so obvious to people who are in the know, but I think that the number of people that are in the know are not that high, especially, among some of our listeners, but probably even more so widespread. Like you said, you're still working on the Saudi thing, and there's probably good reason for that. So like, why Saudi Arabia? Why is this a problem in a very general sense?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think when you're talking about 9/11, you have to I think start with the basic recognition that 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. Osama bin Laden himself was a Saudi. So the impetus for this overwhelmingly comes from Saudi Arabia. And so I think the if this were in a court of law, to me, it's almost like Saudi Arabia is going to have to convince me that they're not guilty. And so because all the evidence points to Saudi Arabia, we know where these folks came from. So what happens next, I think, is even more jarring because of that, because you do have all these Saudi nationals that are flown out of the country. And you do really, you have this very, very concerted campaign to get Saudi Arabia kind of off the hook for what happened. And they did, if you look at some of the, public opinion from back then, Saudi Arabia does take a hit in terms of their, America's preference for them. But 10 years later, most Americans have completely forgotten that the Saudis were Saudi citizens, at least, were actually responsible for 9/11. And I think a big part of that, in addition to the lobbying campaign, in addition to everything that the Saudi royals do to maintain favor in Washington, there were very strong economic interests for the U.S. to play nice with Saudi Arabia, and we said it a lot then. But it's the oil, frankly. The U.S. wanted to keep relations going steady with Saudi Arabia, wanted to keep oil prices down, want to make sure that oil kept flowing. And so, in many ways, they were really willing to bend over backwards for Saudi Arabia. And frankly, they haven't stopped. And you look at the Trump administration was the epitome of this, and just bending over backwards to do everything we could to cater to Saudi Arabia, from turning a blind eye to the war in Yemen, to increasing arms sales to Saudi Arabia, and just Trump going to Saudi Arabia and just really singing the praises of a regime that continues to be, a gross human rights abuser, destabilizing the Middle East with the war in Yemen, Syria too, not to mention there, and of course the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And then even with all that stuff, everything that the Saudis did, they really weren't punished. There really hasn't been any serious, reprisals from the U.S. to punish Saudi Arabia for what it's done. And I still think the reason I still focus on them is because that is by and large a product of their, frankly, highly successful influence operation that they're still running in America.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt that that has always been the elephant in the room. And I mean, I remember reading, I was in the army. I may have been a cadet, reading like House of Bush, House of Saud, these books. And there was a moment where many in the foreign policy establishment, especially once there was kind of a pivot away from Bush, started to say things like, "Oh, it's too simplistic to say no blood for oil. It's not all about oil. That's like such a surface level argument." But I think that what you're bringing into the analysis and what you just said is that, well, look, oil and energy and strategic location were always a prime factor. It's just that the way that works isn't as clear cut, maybe, as some folks say. But let us not forget that in fact, if you kind of scratch away the surface, you take a little sandpaper to the lingo, that's what's there. And I think that's right. Pretty important. So Henry, take us through just your general questions on general foreign policy influence or foreign actor influence, because I think this goes so much deeper, and of course the Saudis will keep coming up, but there's so much to it.
So one thing I noticed going through it, and I try to look at base level stuff partly because I don't have the brain space that Danny does. But that we are it's so easy to miss the simplicity of certain things. And so my question for you, Ben, is it I saw mentioned about contributions or connections to the office of the U.S. Secretary of Defense. And could you talk us through that a little bit about like what kind of stuff does the SecDef's office need lobbying for? Need these connections? Need these kind of strings to pull on?
Oh, it's a great question. And I, I rarely get to talk about this. So I'm glad you asked it. But I think everybody asks, well, I always get asked, well, who's the most influential lobby? who gets it done the best for them? Is it, is it the Saudis or is it Israel? Is it somebody else? And I often will stop them in their tracks and I'll say, no, it's the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense is by far the best lobbying firm in Washington D.C. And the reason for that, in particular, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, in the chiefs of all the services, they're just incredibly adept at working the Hill to get the budgets that they want. And for them, I think the results speak for themselves. If you look at the DoD budget, despite I think what some of my friends at the Heritage Foundation might say, the DoD budget right now is near historic highs. And in fact, the historic highs were towards the beginning of the Obama administration, 2010, 2011. Were historical highs. But we're close to that still, and yet people are still crying about the DoD budget being low. And a big part of that is that the Secretary of Defense and all those folks, policy folks over there, they spend a good bit of time working the Hill, having meetings with folks on the Hill, and it's very. We could have a whole another podcast and I'd be very curious to hear both of your thoughts on the civilian military divide right now. And the problem that I see is that I don't really think that Congress is holding up its end of the bargain on congressional oversight of the military. What my experience and seeing folks on the Hill is that if a general says it, they will roll over and believe it hands down, even if it's something just as ridiculous as the F-35 is perfectly fine and it's not wasting any money. A general says that, a member of Congress says, well, okay, I guess I got to believe you that one of the worst, the biggest waste of money in military acquisition history, it's perfectly fine. But there's just this level of trust right now, or it's beyond trust. It's sort of blindly believing anything that's told to them by a military officer. And I think Congress has a duty. They literally have a constitutional oversight role, and I really think when it comes to DoD right now that they are blowing that oversight role.
Because looking through the report, we there's sections for the Air Force and there's sections for the Army and the Marine Corps, but we don't think of DoD as being a beast unto itself, that it can do some of its own things separate from the branches, and that if you didn't know to ask about that, you just wouldn't hear about it. The other one I found, and this wasn't surprising to me, was the Department of Homeland Security. How big of a slice of pie that has in terms of the lobbying. Will you talk to us a little bit about the nature of funding in terms of that it's all voluntary, that what we find out from these institutions is what they choose to tell us, not what the law says they're required to provide. And then I'm sure that goes to your congressional oversight as well.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. The Homeland Security funding was absolutely interesting. And to be clear about that funding, the funding they were talking about is going to the think tanks. In a big chunk of that Homeland Security money was going to the Rand Corporation. And I imagine a lot of your listeners are familiar with Rand, but for those who aren't, the Rand Corporation is effectively it's kind of colloquially called the DoD's think tank. This is a place where folks in the DoD can go to, and it's many parts, many parts of it are these federally funded research centers that are in some cases exclusively funded by the DoD. And they're designed to sort of be like kind of like the brainiacs for DoD, where DoD can go to, can pay them some money to do these studies on just about anything under the sun, climate change or Arctic security issues, you name it, and Rand's done a study on it. And they're good studies. I find little fault with the studies that Rand conducts, whether it's for DoD or whether it's for the Department of Homeland Security. They're good. They're good objective researchers, I think. But at the end of the day, there's a sort of selection bias coming in about which studies that they'll do. In other words, DoD is only going to pay for certain kinds of studies. And so even if the work itself is, purely objective and it's good, it's unbiased, there's a built-in bias in that, us peaceniks, we already mentioned Code Pink earlier, Medea Benjamin is not funding too many RAND studies. I would be surprised if she's ever funded a single RAND study. So there's this inherent bias built in where you're not having, pacifists that are funding studies or that are driving the research agenda for these think tanks, and Rand's the epitome of it. But some of the other think tanks are right in there too. Whether it's some of the ones that got less funding than Rand did. The Center for New American Security, or CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. They both got millions of dollars too from the U.S. government and defense contractors, and you see a similar bias in the work that they're doing too. It's very heavily DoD focused, and particularly for those two think tanks, you can see some of the work, just at least to me, seems to be very biased towards a more militarized U.S. foreign policy and more defense spending.
So the idea that that any kind of non-offensive action, those kind of studies, they simply wouldn't show up.
That's exactly right. Yeah, you just don't see those studies about the value of what if we didn't go to war, or what if we didn't increase, what if there was a way to reduce the threat of China? What would the economic benefits be of that? Or how much money could we save if we didn't keep raising tensions with Iran? You don't see these studies of these trade-offs for these alternative, more peaceful paths. Those studies just aren't being done, or they're certainly not being done by a lot of these think tanks. You get some of those from outside of it, right? Organizations like the Brown, the Cost of War Project, of course, is a great example of this. But having studies that show you the value of peace are incredibly rare because the war profiteers are funding most of these studies.
And Ben, you're on staff at CIP. I'm a senior fellow there. You probably have, more knowledge of the internal kind of workings of CIP. But I noticed in, one of the next reports we're going to talk about, my favorite, right, or recent favorite on the think tank funding, you looked into the top 50 think tanks, right? What's considered by a number of different measures the top 50 think tanks in America. I noticed that that are a think tank, right? CIP wasn't on that list. And so uh, I was wondering, maybe you could kind of just, as a way of transition, talk about how, like, yes, you're in the think tank world, but what are the differences in terms of funding source? You don't have to get into a ton of detail, but what are the differences in funding source for a place like CIP versus a place like RAND, or the two favorites, the archetypal favorites, in fact, of the Biden transition team, for example, which, as you mentioned, the two tanks of CNAS and CSIS. So, what's the difference, and I guess the obvious, what's the implication of that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's so many differences, and it really does start. One takeaway I hope folks have from the think tank funding report is that funding matters, and it in many ways the funding a think tank gets can drive that think tank's work. It can drive that think tank's conclusions of its work, and in that, its work is designed to influence U.S. foreign policy or U.S. domestic policy, and depending on the think tank too. And so, what we see with comparing a place like CIP to think tanks like that, CIP right off the bat doesn't accept corporate money, no corporate money whatsoever. And so forget defense contractor money. CIP doesn't take money from Google, Microsoft, none of the tech companies, none of the big oil and gas companies, no big Wall Street firms, no lobbying firms for that matter. None of that. The Fortune 500, is off our radar. It's just not a funding source that we will accept money from. We also, my program specifically will not take any foreign government money. And in fact, CIP only has one foreign government donor, and that's the government of Norway, who gives some money to a CIP program called Mighty Earth to do some environmental work. And other than that, CIP doesn't get any foreign government money either. And as I found out in two different reports this year, if you take out both of those sources of money, foreign government funding and U.S. government and defense contractor funding, those businesses, well, that's over $1 billion in funding. It's around $1.2 billion in funding that you're eliminating in the past 6 years. So what that then means for CIP is that CIP remains small. We're a small think tank. I mean, especially compared to places like CNAS and CSIS, they dwarf us in size. And a big part of that is because they have such a larger funding base that they can pull from. But then that's where I think, at least I guess I'm biased, being a CIP fellow, I think that's where their advantage ends. Because, with that funding, there come strings attached. And now they would debate me about, how extensive those strings are, that sort of thing. Sure. And all the think tanks that we talk to, they claim to have rigorous conflict of interest policies. Sure, that's all well and good. But my challenge would be to them is to keep writing reports that are critical of one of your funders and then see how long they keep funding you. And the answer is not long. And we've seen this with think tanks before, and it's very obvious how the system works. So the advantage for a place like CIP then for folks like Danny and I is, big disadvantage right off the bat. We don't have their salaries. We don't have these nice big houses and, fancy cars that they do and everything. But we have a huge advantage in our research is that we don't have to cater to some foreign government's interests. We don't have to do the whims of a defense contractor. And we can say things that are critical about the U.S. government too, because we're not relying on them for funding either. And so it really provides us with a level of intellectual freedom and intellectual objectivity that the folks at these other think tanks just don't have. And at the end of the day, for Danny and I know for the both of us, we can sleep well at night knowing that the work we do, we're not doing at the behest of some big corporation or some foreign power. we're doing the work we do because we think it's right.
The guys and I love doing the podcast. Being able to share our experiences in the military with allies and supporters means the world to us. But we can't do all the work. We need you to share an episode of ours with someone, anyone whom you might think would be affected by it. Young people looking to join the military or parents advocating for one, conscientious citizens who care about the violence the U.S. wages in their name, advocates for women and people of color who understand the harsh environment the military creates for minorities and inflicts on minorities across the globe, and anyone else you think it might affect. Please take a moment and share this with them. Our podcast is supported in a few different ways. First, there's Patreon, where we're blessed to have an array of wonderful supporters, helping the guys and I pay for some of the podcast's expenses. Those who contribute $10 a month or more will be mentioned right here as an honorary producer, helping keep you, our listeners, stocked with new episodes. But you don't have to contribute $10 a month to help us. For as little as $1 a month, you can help keep us going, paying for hosting and storage fees, transcribing old and new episodes, promoting and expanding the podcast, and more I'm sure I can't think of at the moment. So let's bring out our honorary producers, and they are Will Arenz, Fahim Shirazi, James O'Barr, Adam Bellows, Eric Phillips, Paul Appel, Julie Dupree, Thomas Benson, Emma P., Janet Hansen, Tristan Oliver, Daniel Fleming, Michael Karen, Jason, Zach H., Ren Jacob, and the Status Quo podcast. Your contributions are wonderfully helpful to us. Thank you so much. However, if Patreon isn't your style, you can contribute directly to us through PayPal at paypal.me/Fortress on a Hill. Or please check out our awesome store on Spreadshirt.com for some great Fortress merch. The link is in the show notes. And now, let's get back to the podcast.
So let's, and it's true, we talked about that the other day on our call, there's no, talk about classic self-righteous standing, but there is this notion that there isn't a price on looking yourself in the mirror. Can't put a price on that, but also even just in the practical sense, I've found, and I imagine you have too, that there's solace and there's benefit personally to the independence of knowing that you don't have to couch everything you write and everything you say,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's indirectly through concern that, maybe this is gonna upset the bosses because they may not say it, but the bosses are linked to these folks, not just financially, but maybe professionally, socially, cocktail party wise,
Right.
as Kelly Vlahos wrote about, the people who were putting together the surge in Afghanistan, many of whom are about to re-enter the administration. She talked about going to a party, a cocktail party of generals and these civilian national security officials, and she referred to the women as hawks who were in smart skirts, but I love that line, and Scott Horton quotes it all the time. But there's something to that, and I think what you're talking about here is that there are direct and there are indirect ramifications to that funding. It's a delusion to think that these groups stay completely independent, and yet when I was doing my research building on yours, you note that whether it's the Atlantic Council or CSIS or CNAS or Brookings, there's always a note. And I think you've said you've sort of received things like this from their public affairs officials, but, correct me if I'm wrong, that,
Mm-hmm.
oh, no, regardless of funding, we are completely scholarly and independent. And it's almost like the lady doth protest too much a bit. And I think this is interesting. So I guess pivoting now, your report is, and we're going to link to it, your report is just unflinching in its statistics, in its evidence. I mean, it's so careful about making sure that everything's right. I mean, you tack towards the side of caution and the low estimates and all this.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that, right? I'm a researcher too. I mean, it's like my favorite thing to do is go on like a Wikipedia spiral, but with real sources, which is how people like you and I end up in this work. But what, in practice, and you do a little of this in the report, and I know you've done it in articles, in practice, whether anecdotally or generally, what does this look like? What does the influence look like? How does it affect the bottom line of policy, and what is done in the name, whether we know it or think about it or not, in the name of the American people?
Yeah, the thing about the funding and going through and looking at all of it, and that's really where we started with this report, and in the preceding the prequel, I guess, on foreign funding of think tanks, was a very similar approach. We started by saying we just want to get the money. We want to for the first time we want to add up all this money, and we want to get it from all the sources we can, and that included me sending some pretty nice emails, I thought, to these think tanks, and asking them if the information we had was correct, and if they had more information to provide, and getting confirmation of all this stuff. And it might surprise folks today. I did have some pretty good conversations with some folks at think tanks, about their funding and about these issues too, to sort of get their side of the story. But we really started, we wanted to know that we had the best available data out there on these top 50 think tanks. And I feel very confident that we did. And I feel very confident because in the case of both reports, I got from communications directors at those think tanks who were angry emails that said, you claim in your report that we get funding from, XYZ country or this defense contractor or that, we don't have any records of that. Where are you pulling this information from? And then I send back a very polite email that says, well, here's our source from it, and that source is your website, or it's in your own annual report. It's on page 43, and here's the exact digits that we found. So in many cases, we were able to provide these think tanks with, I think, even more transparency than they knew that they had. So starting it from that point to us was incredibly important. Because then we could do what was actually my favorite part about it is trying to connect the dots with this. So once we had the funding, then we went back and took a real hard look at what did these think tanks do? What did they do that was related to some of these funders? What did they put out that might have been of interest to them? And almost to a think tank, we found that we always found evidence of reports that seemed, overwhelmingly to side with the funders' interests, and whether that was recommending arms sales to a foreign government that had funded them, or whether that was recommending buying more of a weapon that a defense contractor who funds them manufactures. We found some very, very clear linkages. We thought, or you can call them coincidental, whatever you want, but to us it seemed very clear that the thrust of the reports coming out of think tanks does appear to be very much in line with the funding that those think tanks are getting. And this is true. We put out a series of op-eds, and I know you have too, Danny, on everything from the ICBM lobby, ICBM manufacturers, and the nuclear modernization. A lot of the think tanks that are advocating for that, they're funded by the exact same defense contractors that are going to benefit from it. When it comes to arms sales to foreign countries, if you see a think tank really out there advocating for it, chances are they're getting some funding from that very government that's going to be the recipient of that arms sale. So again, it really didn't, to go back to my very opening comments, it really doesn't matter what the foreign policy issue is. Chances are there is funding behind it that's driving that U.S. foreign policy in that direction. And that may have nothing to do with whatever the U.S. national security interest is. This is purely in the interest of those paymasters.
So I think this is important. And one of the things that struck me about the think tank report, especially as I read it sort of repeatedly actually, was that, you know, there's there's a real connection between foreign influence and defense contractor influence and U.S. government influence on these issues. And I think you really raised that very well in this particular report, because they're not discrete, and most things rarely are discrete. And I started looking largely motivated by this report, which really just was perfectly timed. I mean, I don't know if you had some sort of like insider knowledge, or or any of that, but I mean, it's unbelievable, because as this team gets announced, as this team gets announced from Biden, it's like you couldn't have built it any better, because the very think tanks that you're looking at, right? So CNAS and CSIS are the second and sixth, right? I believe from your report, the second and sixth highest recipients of U.S. government and defense contractor funding. And then, I started digging into Michelle Flournoy, because, I'm a little bit obsessed with the Biden bros and sisters coming in. And, you find out in, open source reporting from a number of different sources that, the odds-on favorite for Secretary of Defense was exchanging emails with like the UAE ambassador, pitching a project to, write a report on whether to the extent to which the U.S. should follow the non-binding multilateral kind of control agreement on drones and missile technology. And then, of course, wouldn't you know, CNAS receives his $250K on the report that argues for amending the agreement to allow, the UAE to buy these drones. And then, of course, the Trump administration, which is supposedly the sworn enemy of Flournoy and company, does this very thing. And so what struck me about that was like, wow, there is such a connection between the general work that your initiative does, that you've spent so much time on, in terms of scholarship and public advocacy in your career, and then the funding report. And so maybe you could dig in a little more on that aspect of the nexus between the two, the inextricable link.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that this is where it really gets from kind of 2D muckraking to 3D chess, where we're trying to get to the heart of all these different influences. And, there's all these avenues for influence, right? Whether there's lobbying firms, I think think tanks are another key part of it. We haven't even talked about higher education now, and foreign governments are spending billions of dollars at U.S. colleges and universities too, trying to garner influence there. That's a whole other can of worms. And then we have you have these great nexes between the weapons manufacturers that are making weapons that they of course want to and do sell to foreign governments. And we've seen this with the Saudis previously, and very recently with the United Arab Emirates. We know all of the weapons manufacturers that are going to be part of this deal, and so it's the F-35, it's drones. The folks that are making these weapons, we know they're lobbying for this arms sale. But guess who else is too? The United Arab Emirates, and the UAE has one of the most powerful and influential foreign lobbies in the U.S. And so when you combine all that firepower, if I remember right, last year, the UAE spent almost $20 million on lobbying and PR firms registered under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Combine that with an arms industry who's spending similar amounts of money too, and you sort of get this, weapons spreading transformer of influence that becomes really, really hard to stop. And I think we're seeing it now with this UAE arms sale, and I think the progressive community is putting up a good fight against this arms sale. But it's really, again, it's David versus Goliath. They have armies of lobbyists, and we just don't have the numbers to go up against them. But I think hopefully on this we're at a point, at least on this specific deal, where most members of Congress like sort of get it, how this could be really dangerous. to give the United Arab Emirates F-35s and armed drones. They've seen what the UAE did in Yemen, and they see what the UAE does at home, frankly, with the human rights issues there. So I think, hoping maybe there's enough members of Congress there that can push back on this trifecta of kind of war profiteering, weapons building influence. But it's frankly like it's emblematic of the industry as a whole. There's all these connections and these nexuses that bring together these individually hugely powerful lobbying firms, and then they combine forces to push these initiatives through, and they can become incredibly hard to stop because of it. But on the flip side of that, for me, these are the most fun because I can track all of these different influences. So it's just a matter of connecting all the dots here and identifying all these influences, and trying to call folks out when they're engaging in some of this behavior that they probably shouldn't be, or at the very least, I really don't think it's in the interest of America to have the United Arab Emirates with armed drones anytime soon. And I'll just say, Danny, one note on top of that, the Michelle Flournoy thing. I had been following her since her time at CNAS, and she's. I really just want to push back real quickly on folks who think like we shouldn't be critical of some of the Biden administration, and I think first and foremost, I'm a progressive, and so I'm much happier to see Biden and very qualified Biden folks coming in. I'm very happy to see them coming in versus the Trump administration, which I think was awful for many, many reasons. But at the same time, I don't think it serves anyone if we just unflinchingly accept any nominee just because they're a Biden nominee. I think it's very important for folks to take a long, hard look at these folks' qualifications, and many of them are very, very qualified too. But I think we have every right to call out their connections with the arms industry, and we have every right to call out their connections with foreign governments. And Michelle Flournoy was at the perfect nexus of this to me, because while she was at CNAS, she as you mentioned, she accepted $250,000. CNAS accepted $250,000 to write this study that was about drones. And of course, the study comes out and it says, recommends, among other things, to give the UAE armed drones. And then going forward, of course, we've seen these past few months, the UAE looks to be on track to get those armed drones. And so I think we have a right to be critical of Michelle Flournoy for at least in some way kind of being one of the original advocates for that deal and helping to pave the way for the UAE to get to the point where they could even be lobbying for a deal like this. And so, whether that means Michelle Flournoy should or should not be Secretary of Defense, I don't know. That's a decision for somebody else. But as for me, Ben Freeman, you can sure as heck bet I'm going to tell people at least about her connections with that foreign government. And I did the exact same thing with the Trump administration, and I'll do it throughout the Biden administration too.
Yeah, I think that you raise a really important point about when is critique, when is a critical eye appropriate, and I think the answer is almost always, right? I mean, if you're going to be intellectually and ethically consistent, then it's important to raise questions. And the qualification point, is something that I can get a little radical on. And so, I'll often say that, these folks are eminently qualified. Only I reject the cult of qualification, or I reject the terms of the qualification cult's game. In other words, like I'm concerned, and this is personal opinion, I'm interested in your thoughts on it. I'm concerned by the notion that previous complicity and some often largely nefarious actions even if they are, a gradation below certain Bush ones, some Trump ones, or most Bush ones, some Trump ones, even if they're preferable in a comparative sense when we talk lesser evils, the idea that there aren't other qualified, if we change the terms of that discussion, that there aren't other qualified figures who could serve in the National Security Council, as Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, who don't have this taint, right? And the sad truth is maybe there really aren't that many. Maybe this game that you've been describing, this one that you've been unearthing, this one that you've been doing just unflinching research on, is so established that it is actually difficult to find quote qualified people that aren't tainted, that don't carry some of this with them. But I'd be interested in your thoughts, as kind of a last point on this issue with the transition on, do you think that we frame it in such a way, and I guess this is a leading question, but I mean, I really want to know what you think. Do you think that we frame who is a viable candidate in such a way that it maybe, reduces the numbers available or kind of cuts other folks out of the game?
Yeah, I think you're really on to something here, and I had just it's fascinating to hear you say that, because I had sort of in my own world and in my own research, I viewed what I now think is the same concept, but I looked at it as all of this, whether it's somebody working at a think tank, or being an industry lobbyist, or working at DoD, is all kind of part of this like sphere of influence, all this like kind of connected web, and you could stay in it. And to your earlier point about the dinner parties, you could keep getting invited to the dinner parties, as long as you stayed on message. You can tack a little bit this way or a little bit that way, but fundamentally, if you wanna keep getting invited to the game, you have to stay on the DoD message, and whether that's a DoD message about the Asia pivot, or kind of all the fear mongering that's going on around China right now. Whatever the issue of the day is, as long as you stay within relative bounds around that, then you're eligible, and you would be in the hunt for some of these nominations. But I think you're exactly right that if you get outside of that frame, and you start questioning some of these things, offering alternative approaches to U.S. foreign policy, more frankly, more peaceful foreign policies that don't require as much DoD spending, would reduce the revenue that defense contractors are getting. You start recommending things like that, and you can watch your dinner invites go down to nothing, and literally your ticket to the party will go away, and that will certainly mean that they won't consider you for any of these political appointments.
So, and I'm just gonna throw this out there because it just was in my brain. What would you fellas say to somebody like Andy Basovich? That where would he fit into this invited to dinner category, just on what you guys know of his belief in policy and such?
I mean, I think he would get invited, and he would get invited, and I think that this is really like a testament to the Quincy Institute, and what they're doing there now is they're really creating a space, a good intellectual space, to have conversations about restraint, to have conversations about non-intervention, and I think it's a kudos to them that somebody like Andy Basovich, would be at these tables now, and he probably would be, before to some tables, um, but I think now more than ever he would be welcomed at those tables, and I think still too the Cato Institute is still doing some great work on having these conversations, about restraint, about non-intervention. They're in some ways they are their own tables, but there are maybe some exceptions out there.
Well, I've got it. I've got the team. Biden says that he wants a bit of a bipartisan unity government, right? He wants experienced technocrats and practitioners. I've got it now, right? Secretary of State Larry Wilkerson, Secretary of Defense Andrew Bacevich, and look, we need some like still Republicans. National Security Advisor Danny Davis. Problem solved. World's problem solved. Ben, Henry, and Danny, it's done. Joe, Uncle Joe, whoever translates English for you today. I know. But I mean, seriously, there are other voices, and those are folks that we kind of know, and certainly I do, and all that. And there's other voices out there in the academic community, and but the idea of like the practitioner meets the scholar, I do think that there are other voices, and probably my reach in knowledge of those folks is extremely limited. So I think that's an important question that you ask, Henry.
Can I just, I would like to tack onto that real quick and give a shameless plug to CIP's Sustainable Defense Task Force, which I co-chaired with our colleague Bill Hartung. And in that was a project that we did almost 2 years ago now. We brought together kind of the folks like this. And you actually reminded me, Danny, with Larry Wilkerson. He's on our task force. Larry Korb is too. And we had Republicans and Democrats. Gordon Adams, Amy Belasco from the Congressional Research Service. We had a really good mix of folks from both sides of the aisle, but kind of the voices that you wouldn't hear at some of these dinner parties, but folks with very different experiences who we all brought together and we said, well, what can we do differently? Like we're all sort of whining about the way it's done. How can we do this differently? And we laid it out in a very short 90-page paper. But there's a summary on it on our website that you can check out. But it was designed to get to this exact point here. And as good as that was, I would love if other groups would do that too. The more of those we get out there in the ecosphere, the better the conversations we can have are.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. And I think that there is more, just like there's more agreement on foreign and war policy between Republicans and Democrats than they make out, right? There is a bipartisan consensus for interventionism, at least, or expeditionary posture. There's also more agreement in the opposition, right? In the often silenced, or, Quincy's having a really great effect, and Cato's always been kind of stalwart on this. But overall, I think, kind of a generally like ignored or silenced or sidelined opposition, there's always been, and there remains, more agreement between, say, libertarians and progressives. I mean, I did a salon with I forget the name of the organization. I hate myself for it, but it was about Danny Davis's book, and and they asked Matt Ho and I to come on and do like a 5 to 10 minute plug, kind of building on Danny Davis's book, right? And I mean, if you've seen Danny Davis, you've seen him on Fox News. He'll tell you whether you don't have to ask Danny to tell you that he remains generally a Republican. He's kind of fierce about it. And I think it's deeply held. And I also think that there's, value in saying, listen, there's a lot of us who agree about this, who come from different backgrounds. But, it's so interesting because, the three of us are speaking on this thing. And it struck me that we've got Danny Davis, who remains a Republican and definitely has like conservative instincts or reflexes, at least. You've got me, who, I mean, depending on who you ask, is definitely radical, proclaims himself on the left, but is often hated by that same left. And then you got Matt Ho, who's like in divinity school to be like a Buddhist divinity school, or there's probably a better term for it, right? And is out on a different kind, but very similar left as me. And it's like, wow, we're all here having this discussion. And so I think that there's a lot of value in that. I posted, because, I am who I am, right? I posted something yesterday about, dear libertarians and progressive anti-war folks, remember that, Raekwon and Ghostface Killer of the Wu-Tang Clan used to shoot at each other's apartment projects before they were in the greatest hip-hop collective of all time. This is important, and I think that in the scholarly community, it's a credit to CIP, of course, that there are folks that are advising and involved and invited to the table who come from these variety of backgrounds. And, for one last kind of pivot and a plug, but an important plug, I think that your work in general shows we're not talking necessarily about like a political kind of spectrum per se, although I think it's largely completely not apolitical. It's mostly factual, regardless of your own personal views. But the breadth, the depth of the reports is obvious. And you talked about 90 pages in that last one. I mean, the think tank report is, dozens of pages, but breadth of topics, obviously you do foreign influence transparency stuff. You've done a lot of focus on Saudi Arabia, but the latest report that really dropped like 4 or 5 days ago, since we're recording today on the 24th, was on Japan's influence in America. And I just want to ask you to like kind of briefly give us like the 101 on that, because I think that most Americans have forgotten about the deep connection of the United States to the Japanese at the end of World War II. And they certainly don't see, nor that I'm saying that that's what the report concludes, but nor do they see like anything odious at all or anything concerning at all about like Japan and the United States. I mean, since the kind of gung-ho 80s where there was this like concern that like Japan's going to take over and with their economics, they don't even get in the conversation anymore. So what was that about, I guess?
God, I mean, if nothing else, I would have just done it for all the reasons you just said there, just to surprise people. That's all the motivation I need. But all jokes aside on that, I think it is kind of for that reason too, that folks in the fray of worrying about Russian influence, worrying about Chinese influence, which we should be very, very much worried about. I agree with all that. But I think we've gotten, maybe a little too focused on them. And we've forgotten that some of these other countries, who we consider allies, we consider to be our friends. And heck, Saudi Arabia and the UAE would fall into that category too. And Japan, even next level up. These countries too are allies. Sometimes they can lead us astray too. In their interest, just because they're our allies doesn't mean their interests are always in line with our interests. And another thing about Japan too, and I'll give a spoiler to or a little teaser to your readers or your listeners, that our next report is actually on South Korea. And the reason we wanted to take a look at both of them year in and year out, those two countries are actually the biggest spenders when it comes to foreign lobbying in the U.S. Year in and year out. They spend an incredible amount of money. Tens of millions of dollars. They even dwarf the Saudi spending, the Emirati spending. Qataris, it's not even close. Japan and South Korea are far and away ahead. And for Japan, what we found in the Japan report was this huge lobbying operation. A big chunk of it is driving a greater militarization of U.S. foreign policy in the region there. Some of it's related to China. But a lot of it in Japan's case is just kind of, in their own sort of self-interest. Japan folks often forget, especially folks not in the military, that the U.S. has tens of thousands of soldiers stationed on Japanese soil, mostly in Okinawa. They're also a huge recipient of U.S. military sales as well. And so Japan is really big business for defense contractors and for the Department of Defense. And so a lot of what Japan is doing with this lobbying operation, it's actually not too dissimilar from what the Saudis are doing in many cases. They're advocating for arms sales. They're advocating to keep U.S. soldiers on Japanese soil to keep those bases there, and to get the latest and greatest weapons, whether it's a THAAD missile system, or just the latest equipment that they need for the base there. They're hitting all those high notes and all of the big, foreign policy issues in the region too, from, trade deals, TPP, you name it when it comes to economic issues. They're lobbying heavily on those. And they're lobbying heavily here in the U.S. We found some lobbyists. We're talking to folks in New York State about the text that was being provided in some public schools related to the Sea of Japan. And they had some qualms about it, so they wanted the textbook changed. And we saw the fascinating kind of local lobbying exchange on this. And the point of us highlighting it in the report is to show that they're so comprehensive that they'll hit the biggest foreign policy issue of the day and the most mundane issue at a local level. You might have a Japanese foreign agent, working on all of these different issues. And so it's really just extraordinary what Japan's doing here in the U.S. So I would definitely encourage anybody listening to give that report a read. It was even for a nerd like me who studies foreign influence for a living, it was eye-opening.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that there's there's a side of folks like us, I think, who are tacked towards the geeky and just enjoy a research project. There's a tendency to be like, wow, there's value in just the knowing and also in the surprising and kind of poking. But what's interesting about this Japan and South Korea factor is that it is enormous. B, that the fact that it's enormous flies largely under the public radar. And C, and probably most disturbingly, that all of it links so much and so relevantly to the drum up, acceleration, and alarmism that's bipartisan surrounding New Cold War Theater 2, because there's going to be two fronts to this one. There already are. Theater 2, East Asia, right? And China and all this, because they're so linked. And so you've managed in your last two reports, if I can blow a little smoke up your intellectual ass, I mean, you've managed in the last two reports to basically show us that from, Washington's headquartered corridors of the defense and military government industry to the princely capitals of Arab autocrats and all the way on to the Korean peninsula and, the Japanese archipelago, that this is a systemic problem, or at least a systemic issue, one that requires attention. And I really do think that someone could read your last 3, 4, 5 reports, and it would provide essentially a treasure trove for authors of columns of books to kind of go off of. And so we're gonna link definitely to the last two, as well as, of course, just to your bio page at CIP, which for the listeners, I mean, you can find everything there. And again, shameless plug for Ben's colleagues and mine, Bill Hartung, who's a Tom Dispatch regular that I've spoken with in Boston and is doing the arms control stuff, and then the newer Africa program, and so many others. I mean, check all of that out. And so, as we wrap up now, Ben, I want to really just genuinely, because there's so much important stuff, give you an opportunity to, raise anything else that's kind of on your mind, but also kind of close out with just a brief run through of like what folks should do to check out your work and then the work of your just like tireless colleagues who don't get the attention that they often need.
Yeah. Thanks for the opportunity. It's just been great talking with you guys, number one. I think if I had one takeaway or one thing I wanted to get back to is it was really something you said earlier, Danny, and it alluded to a point that I always like to remind people of, that this crazy industry that I study, the foreign influence industry, it's really one of the few areas in DC that is absolutely bipartisan. The both in terms of the targets of the influence, in all these reports I've mentioned, whether it's in Japan, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, we see these lobbyists that are working for foreign governments. They contact Democrats and Republicans with just about equal frequency. The lobbyists themselves, many of these folks are revolving door folks, and so they're both Republicans and Democrats too. For example, I was taking a hard look at Egypt today, and there's a firm, Brownstein Hyatt Farber Schreck, that just started representing the government of Egypt. And the two people that are heading up this operation, one is former Congressman Ed Royce, a Republican from California, and his co-lead on it is Nancy Pelosi's former chief of staff. So if that's not bipartisanship in Washington, I don't know what is. So I assure you, if you're a partisan, you can find some muck in our reports to go after the other side, or if you just think both sides are corrupt, read any of our reports, and it will confirm that suspicion, because it very much is both sides that are hard at work in this foreign influence field. And in terms of where you can track this down, go check out our website, please. You can find Danny's work there too, at internationalpolicy.org. And my program there is the Foreign Influence Transparency Initiative. You can check out all our reports there. Our most recent one, on the Japan lobby, the one before that on U.S. government and defense contractor funding of think tanks. There's the foreign funding of think tanks there. There's the Qatar lobby, Saudi lobby, UAE lobby. We got all kinds of lobbies, hotel lobbies maybe. But you can find all our great work there. And you can find me on Twitter at Ben Freeman DC too. And if I can help with any of the work that folks are doing out there, I'd be happy to. We got more information than we know what to do with, frankly.
Yeah, Ben, thanks for that. And, we're going to link to some of the key things. Do check it out. Follow Ben on Twitter, check out the site, check out the other scholars, and let this be for you, hopefully, what it's largely been for me, which is just, a portal into so much more, right? So, because all of these different programs at CIP, they link to each other, they're related. Finding one scholar leads you to another. You'll start on CIP and you'll end up in a million other places, because there's so many important folks doing this work. And the more we can do to foreground it, the better. So, Ben, I just want to thank you again for coming on. It's been a great chat. I knew it would be. I was looking forward to it, especially after we spoke, right up to both of our meetings, and a little late last time we chatted over Zoom. And, thanks for coming on Fortress on a Hill. I know we're going to have you back if you're willing, because I know you're going to raise reports that are just and op-eds and stuff too that are just so relevant. And it's just nice talking to you because of your scholarship and just general character and good dudeness, for lack of a better word. So thanks again.
Hey, thanks a lot, Danny, and thanks, Henry, for having me on, man. This has been great. I'd love to come back on.
Yeah, great to talk to you, Ben.
All right. Well, listeners, keep an eye out. We've got some more folks coming on. We've got Vince Emanuel from Park Media. We're bringing Tom Secker back. I'm actively recruiting Ben Norton from Moderate Rebels. The guest list is just going to churn on from here. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz coming back again to talk some Indigenous history and everything else. So stay tuned. Keep following us. Check out Patreon. And thanks for listening.
We're on Twitter at Fortress on a Hill, and also at Facebook.com at Fortress on a Hill. You can find our main blog page and our full collection of episodes at www.fortressonahill.com. iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Patreon, Spotify. You name it, almost anywhere you listen, we're already waiting for you. And hey, we're always in the market for more Patreon supporters. Please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com. And if you're not into giving us a monthly payment, think about giving us a couple bucks on PayPal. The link is in the show notes. Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.
And listen to my song. I hope you'll pay I will not